good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to day 2 of the 2021 International Conference on Official Statistics. On behalf of Statistics Korea and the United Nations Statistics Division, I'd like to thank all of the speakers and participants for joining us at this event. I am Hyunshim Choi, Master of Ceremonies of this conference. Our conference this year is organized under the theme of the role of data and statistics in understanding and mitigating risk, what we have learned from crisis situations, including the global pandemic. Building on yesterday's discussion, we will be exchanging concrete experiences in responding to challenges. Today, we're introducing an interesting format in which same topics are addressed twice by distinctive groups of panelists. In other words, the conference part A will offer sessions 4 and B, followed by a 4-hour break. And then the conference part B will have sessions 4 and 5 once more, with a new group of panelists. In doing so, we intend to cover broader geographic and contextual landscape. If you registered at the conference and are joining us through a live streaming in our official conference website, you can choose either Korean or English channel using the live streaming menu options. Also, anyone joining us through our official conference website can raise questions and share comments through the website. There is a comment section under the live streaming tab in the website, and we encourage you to actively participate in Q&A and discussion by using this comment section to compose your questions and comments. The website also provides detailed information of this conference, including its program, biography of speakers, and presentation materials for downloading. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the keynote speaker for day 2 of the ICOS. Ms. Sheda Badii, Managing Director of Open Data Watch, has been an active member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Group on Data Revolution, co-chairs the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, known as SDSN, and has played a key role in initiating the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Previously, she worked at the World Bank and served as the long-term director of the Development Data Group. She also participated in and led the launch of many global statistical products and initiatives, including the World Bank Open Data Initiative. With that, let me give the floor to Ms. Badii.
Thank you very much, and greeting to all. I'm delighted to be providing the keynote presentation for day 2 of the International Conference on Official Statistics. The topic selected is really most timely and critical. In fact, looking back, I have the fondest memories from this conference in 2017, both because it was in person in Seoul, where we got to meet many partners, but also the topic, one close to my heart, on open data. That conference at that time provided a very frank and substantive discussions on open data, which we have systematically followed up since then. For today, in my presentation, my focus will be on building better statistical systems, learning from crisis, based on the work of my group, Open Data Watch, working with many close partners. I would like to share with you 6 lessons that we have learned that point to key vulnerability areas that countries face that affect them negatively during crisis and have to be mitigated or ways to mitigate and maybe even ease the negative effects. So let me go through those 6 lessons one by one. Lesson 1 is that crisis and emergencies due to conflict, natural disaster, and pandemics such as COVID-19 are on the rise, as we're all observing. Amid these hardships, people are born, get married, divorce, and die. So we need robust statistical and administrative systems to capture critical information. One of those critical systems is civil registration and vital statistics systems. Without robust CRVS systems, governments struggle to understand the scale of a crisis accurately and plan services and safeguard basic human rights. The reason for why we need better CRVS systems are clear, but we still see many poor functioning systems across the world. Many births still go unregistered, and even death, of course, as you've heard earlier, 40% worldwide are unregistered, and many other critical life events such as marriage and divorce. On the other hand, there are many successful examples and best practices of how a country overcomes all odds and gets back on track harnessing CRVS systems in conflict, emergencies, and fragile settings. Recently, working with partners, we have published a compendium on CRVS in time of crisis, which documents such cases and shares those experiences to safeguard people's rights to access services during conflict, protect the rights of refugees and migrants, and be used to respond to natural disasters or health crises like COVID-19. So let's move to lesson 2. Lesson 2 is that based on 2 different studies that we have done, we see that we have a significant issue with many data systems in countries if they continue to not be able to produce more sex-disaggregated data and make it available for time of crisis. When we looked at key indicators needed to measure status and well-being of women in 25 countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia Pacific, we see that together only 50% of the needed data are available sex disaggregated, and that is both in national and international databases. Also, we looked at data on health, economic opportunities, and education of women in 75 low and lower middle income countries. Using available data, we could identify countries where women and children were particularly vulnerable to the health and economic impacts of the pandemic. But in many countries, measured weaknesses were compounded by a lack of data needed to assess current conditions or to plan for recovery from COVID-19 crisis. Unless we make major investments in these data systems, these vulnerabilities will persist long after the pandemic has run its course. Let's look at lesson 3. Here we see some good news. We see improvements in open data across the world and in all countries from high income to low income, as the figure on the left shows. Based on Open Data Watch's measure called ODIN, Open Data Inventory, which measures data availability and openness for 178 countries, and it's been doing this since 2015. Despite these open data improvements that we see, we still need improvements in the overall data dissemination practices. As we have seen, that demand for data during crisis rises, and it provides us a great opportunity to create value and use this increased demand for data. Our research shows that we all need to do better to consolidate many websites and make it easier for users to find data. In one of our studies, for example, we found that a country had 20 related websites, which of course you can imagine is very confusing for users. We also need to do better in allowing data interoperability, access to metadata, and overall put users at the center of our data dissemination strategy and measure use and collect feedback. In fact, we will be publishing more research material on this shortly based on a study by ODW and Paris 21. But I think this is a very important lesson on during time of crisis to be able to improve data access and availability. Let's move to lesson 4. Lesson 4, being able to assess capacity and where a country is strong and where it needs more improvement is critical. The ultimate goal is, of course, to have all parts of the statistical systems working together, like foundational systems with administrative systems, with surveys and census, and other components of the national statistical system. But many are weak in one or another, but some at the center of the Venn diagram, as you see, are weak in multiple areas. And some of these weaknesses have been persisting over many, many years. And one of the reasons is that we need to build sustainable systems from production all the way to dissemination and use. It's not good enough if data produced is of high quality and timely, but stays closed and is not disseminated, or even if is available, it's not really used. So this is a particularly important lesson for data to be valuable in time of crisis, such as COVID-19. So we are advocating for building capacity along the data value chain. Lesson 5. We need to all do better in planning and identifying collaborations and resources needed for better and more resilient statistical systems. We are not there yet on this. A recent study shows that of the 74 IDA eligible countries in low-income countries, only 46 have updated NSDSs, and of those, not all critical areas are covered. For example, only half of those 46 mention needs for better gender data and improving capacity for sex disaggregated data. So we need better planning to identify weaknesses and risks and build a realistic budget and resource mobilization plan. We have many best practices in this area to share. My final lesson, lesson 6, is we need to think beyond traditional data productions and look for tools and partners that could help with other existing data and with making smart analysis in time of crisis possible. Here is an example that I'm using of a tool called PopGrid, which many of you have heard of, which is a data collaborative providing geospatial population data consolidated from a variety of sources that could allow authorities to develop responses measures. It's had many successful applications and was very recently used and very popular tool during the Haiti earthquake. And some of the maps that you see are related to the Haiti earthquake. So based on these 6 lessons, let me end by offering a way forward for an enabling environment to utilize lessons learned during crisis and try to mainstream and build better statistical systems. At the national level, we need to capitalize on higher demand for data. And this is really important for us to build on this higher demand for data and use that energy for building better systems. We also need to build on many of the innovative approaches that you've heard during the conference, and you're going to hear more of this. But while it's important to build on these innovative approaches, it is also very critical that in the process, not to forget the importance of building up foundational systems, particularly those critical for times of crisis, like health management information systems and civil registration systems that I showed in my lesson 1. At the international level, I'm particularly excited to see many important initiatives that are coming out, learning from the lessons from our times of crisis. I have covered 3 of them here. One is more and better access to data, both sectoral data, cross-country sectoral data, but, such as the work that the WHO is doing for making health information more accessible and of higher quality, but also examples such as cross-country and agency-wide data, such as the plans that are in the works right now for building a new UN data portal. So this is really exciting at the international level. The second thing I'm very excited about is that in most of these international initiatives, we see that there's importance being attached, and this all the work around data is being complemented with more work on data governance and sharing experience and agreeing on common approaches. And this is what we're going to be hearing a lot more in the next few months about the progress on data stewardship and data governance. And finally, very exciting that the Coalition of Development Data Donors is forming, called the BERN Network, which is one of its key products will be an information hub on smarter financing called the Clearinghouse, and we would be launched at the upcoming World Data Forum. And this will definitely help us with mobilizing more and better financing for development data and all the improvements that we've been discussing in building better statistical systems for time of crisis. So together with the lessons we have learned and many that will be covered during the course of the conference, we will have a rich set of best practices to help us build better data systems. Thank you for the opportunity to share these lessons with you. And I look forward to participating in the sessions that follow, and really look forward to see you in person or in virtually at the World Data Forum in Bern in 32 days. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Ms. Badi for sharing your inspiration with us and articulating key lessons at national and international level. Thanks everyone for your attention. Now, let me invite you to session 4, part A. This session will reflect on the impact of disasters on statistical operation and the responses of national statistical system to these challenges. All our presentation and discussion sessions will be moderated by a session chair. The chair of session 4, part A is Mr. Grant Cameron, Director of the SDSN's Thematic Research Network on Data and Statistics, known as TRENDS, who oversees a work program for bringing innovative approaches to countries in the Global South to improve data for the SDG agenda. Prior to joining the SDSN/Trends, Mr. Grant worked at the World Bank for 15 years, supporting countries to improve their statistical and data capacities to make them more accessible and useful to policymakers and the public. He also served in the Government of Canada and Statistics Canada. With this, I'd like to invite Mr. Cameron to the stage for session 4, part A.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for that delightful introduction. I'm just wondering if someone can nod their head to make sure they can hear me okay. Yes, thank you, Francesca. And yes, I guess to all who are there, welcome or welcome back to the International Conference on Official Statistics. As we've just heard, my name is Grant Cameron, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour and 15 minutes. And you're tuned into session 4, part A. The session is entitled Impact of Disasters on Statistical Operations. How have the national statistical systems responded? And what more kind of relevant question to ask ourselves at a time when we have things like major fires, major hurricanes, and of course a global pandemic coming on stream. To set the stage, I just wanted to say a few opening remarks, and then we'll move into some of the thoughts from the panel. I think it's very safe to say that disasters create a perfect storm for national statistical offices. Disasters make National Statistical Office change how they collect data and change how they produce statistics from the data they're collecting. But as the NSOs scramble to supply statistics during these types of disasters, the demand for their products also increases very quickly and from two sources. One, policymakers want data at finer levels of detail and often combined in new ways to target public sector support to those who need it most. And we heard that in the opening keynote address of this conference last night from our colleague from the WHO, who is encouraging us all to try and find ways to connect information from health data to tax data, et cetera. So we know there's a great demand from policymakers. But we also know that the general public is also going to be pressing for more up-to-date information on disasters so they can take decisions on their own actions. But I guess there's a silver lining to that great challenge that NSOs are facing, and that silver lining is that necessity is the mother of invention. During these crises, NSOs often find new ways to produce data that the public and the policymakers need. To do this, obviously they look to their own institutions' ingenuity and creativity under difficult circumstances, but they also turn to other national statistical offices and international organizations in the global statistics community to gain and share new knowledge, share experiences, so that as a collaborative, all can help adjust their processes and methods. So with that as introduction, I'm now going to move to talk a little bit about our four panelists. We are about to hear, with that as context, the experiences from four different perspectives on the challenges and opportunities of statistical offices working from disasters. At first, we'll hear a global perspective from Ms. Francesca Perucci, the Assistant Director of the United Nations Statistics Division. And then we will hear from three country perspectives, first from the National Statistical Office of Chile, then Vietnam and Jamaica. And I think it's worth noting, if you haven't already, that all three of these countries are particularly vulnerable to certain types of natural disasters, along with, of course, the global COVID pandemic that we're all facing. So we start with Ms. Perucci, who will present findings of a survey of national statistical offices conducted by the UNSD and the World Bank to give us an overview of the circumstances. For those of you attending session 4B, which is quite a bit later if you're on the East Coast of North America, you'll want to note that there's an overlap and an intentional one between Francesca's remarks and the ones that Alberto will be providing at that stage. So I'm now going to ask Francesca to set up her presentation, and for the next 12 minutes, the floor will be hers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Grant, and I'm delighted to be part of this panel and to have our dear colleague Grant as a moderator. Thanks for introducing the topic. As you said, this is a joint work with the World Bank. And there will be another presentation sort of highlighting some of the findings, and there will be some overlaps so I'll allow different audiences to hear some of the same content. Hello, everybody. Good morning to our colleagues in Korea and to our colleagues in Asia, and good afternoon, good evening to all other participants. So. Sorry, there is some delay in the, apologies for that. There is some delay in the connection. When the disaster, when the pandemic hit in the beginning of 2020, we immediately realized that statistical operations were going to have serious disruptions. And we were approached by many of our partners in countries and in the international community to sort of understand how we could offer support to those who needed support in facing the challenges of the pandemic. So jointly with the World Bank and the World Bank's Development Data Group, and in coordination with regional the UN regional commissions, we decided to launch a series of surveys to understand the impact of the global pandemic, and to provide information to the statistical community, to donors, to development partners, on how to mobilize resources and how to offer the needed support in the immediate term, but also how to plan the support that we, of course, understood would be needed also in the long run. So. We covered different themes. If the Secretariat can confirm that my PowerPoint is still showing, because my computer is not advancing the PowerPoint, kindly.
So we're checking if the system allows us to share the screen. Will you give us one moment?
Yes, thank you, because my computer is not allowing me to advance the PowerPoint. I'm sorry.
No problem.
So what we wanted to learn really was the impact of the pandemic on the face-to-face data collection, the extent to which the pandemic had imposed office closures, and the extent to which the staff could telecommute, the continuity of major statistical programs, mainly surveys and censuses, and the impact on the ability of countries to produce the necessary statistics, disseminate them, and fulfill the international reporting requirements. We also wanted to understand the way countries had responded to the new data demands and the challenges they were having in collecting data on population groups of special interest. To what extent they were able to adopt new data solutions, whether or not their ICT infrastructure was sufficient, and what resources constraints they were facing. We also collected information on emergency plans and field protocols. And finally, we wanted to understand the coordination, the level of coordination across the system, and whether they were able to establish the necessary partnerships with different parts of the system, within the government and outside the government, to be able to respond to the new data demands. So how were statistical operations impacted by the pandemic? While many NSOs had reopened after widespread initial closures, we observed that from May to October 2020, offices were closed, but there was a tendency to reopen. In May 21, which is the fourth round of our survey, we noticed that there was actually an inversion of the trend, with offices starting to close again. And that probably because of different stages of and different surges of the pandemic in different parts of the world. So remote work has been the solution in most cases, and staff was instructed to work from home in most countries, in the majority of NSOs, and that trend continued through the four rounds of survey from May 2020 to May 21. And we observed that in May this year, still there was quite a significant percentage of staff working from home, about 50%, at least partially working from home. And after an almost universal suspension of face-to-face data collection, some in-person data collection is now resuming. So while in May 2020, 69% of countries had fully suspended data collection, that percentage was down to 28% in May 21. So that was somehow, with some of the protocols in place to protect both the enumerators and the respondents, the interviewees, some countries were able to resume, at least partially, some in-person data collection. Now, one of the programs most heavily impacted, of course, was the population and housing census. And that was very worrisome because many countries right in 2020 and some in 21 were planning to undertake the 2020 round of population census. And that has, of course, caused a serious disruption, given that the population census is one of the main data sources in many countries. Now, the ability to fulfill reporting requirements was, of course, heavily affected because of these serious disruptions in many of the major statistical operations. And the impact, for instance, was very severe in the ability to report at the international level. And that, of course, includes reporting on the SDGs. So when asked whether the COVID-19 pandemic had negatively affected the current ability to meet international reporting requirements, a total 48% of countries had responded no, but not at all. But 47 responded that they were moderately affected, and 5% were severely affected. And that, of course, that percentage was much higher in low and lower middle income countries, where we had 65% being moderately affected and 8% severely affected. Now, particularly important, as I mentioned in the beginning, was the impact on the more vulnerable group. And as our keynote speaker, Sheda Bedi, very nicely said it in the beginning this morning, safeguarding our most vulnerable is key. And in the implementation of the SDGs, we know that in order to leave no one behind, as is the ambition of the agenda, we need accurate and timely data on all population groups. But we saw that most countries reported having difficulties, in particular, collecting data on specific population groups of interest. And that included migrants, refugees, rural population, older people, persons with disability, and youth. And to give you an example, in the case of migrants, the difficulties due to the pandemic resulted from the number one cause was population groups were hard to reach via phone or internet, which means that in the case of particular population groups, the use of phone or web-based surveys might not necessarily be always the solution, because it tends to leave out the groups that are more difficult to reach. Another cause highlighted was, of course, surveys were suspended, disruption in census operation, and surveys suspended because of funding issues. But most NSOs have stepped up to the challenge. And in fact, I would say many NSOs have turned the pandemic into an opportunity to accelerate modernization. When we asked whether for instance, the overall information and communication technology readiness of their office had changed in the last 6 months, most offices indicated that they had improved. So, and that is across the board in countries of different income level. Of course, the upper middle income and high income level, they had better ability to be ready and improve their ICT, but that was also a trend in some low and lower middle income countries. They also adopted new data solutions, and they were able to adapt quickly to the new challenges. Already the first round of the survey in May 2020 revealed that NSOs were able to turn to phone surveys or better use of administrative data, web surveys, even using data from social media, phone records, remote sensing and satellite imagery, and citizen-generated data. And they were able to establish, apologies, I don't think we have been able to share the PowerPoint. If you can, yes, this is the slide. Thank you. If you can get back to the next slide. Yes, and they were able to establish new partnerships to bridge data gaps. The share of NSOs that have established new partnerships is almost like across the different income groups is quite high. It's a little bit higher, of course, in the case of high income countries, but for all three groups of countries considered, it's quite high. And that includes partnerships to access and use technology, partnerships to access new data sources, and partnership to develop or implement new methods. One challenge, though, identified by most countries in rapidly establishing new partnerships that were needed to bridge data gaps, is that it was hard to formalize the institutional collaborative arrangement. So that's one area where it was some support is certainly needed to raise the capacity of countries. Now, another positive development throughout the crisis is that the critical role of data has become more visible, and that many NSOs have sort of gained a seat at the table with policymakers. So they've been playing a major role in government's COVID-19 responses. For instance, in July 2020, when we asked whether the office had been called to serve on a government crisis response group or advisory committee, already 57% of countries had been involved, responded yes. And in July 2020, so were in implementing COVID-19. It's in October 2020, we asked whether the institution was planned or had implemented the Now, these, of course, are all very positive developments. Sadly, it took a pandemic in many cases to accelerate a process of transformation and innovation that was already ongoing. But to make that sustainable, there is need for funding. And the need for funding has actually increased. Already in May 2020, 6 in 10 national statistical offices reported that they needed additional external support to deal with the new challenges posed by the pandemic. And in the last round of our survey in May 21, we found that actually national statistical offices in low and lower middle income countries saw their funding decrease from both the domestic sources and international sources. So these are some of the highlights of what we found through the 4 rounds of survey to national statistical offices. What we take away from this is that the impacts on statistical operation is still ongoing. There's still disruptions. And the double burden is that there is increased demand for data, while still statistical office cannot fully operate. And this, of course, risks exacerbating global data inequalities and data inequities. And that is because, as we see, countries that are better prepared to take advantage of innovation and can move forward with new data solutions have actually accelerated the process, while countries that didn't have the right ICT infrastructure in place, they didn't have the right skills to be able to embrace those new data solutions, are also those with fewer resources and are falling more behind. So the gap is actually widening. So the response induced an accelerated innovation, which might have lasting effects, but we need more support, technical support and financial support to ensure the sustainability of these new solutions. So the emerging needs are more and better funding, specific investment on ICT infrastructure, more technical assistance, not only technical assistance in terms of enabling countries to use new data solutions, but also wider development support for countries to be able to, for instance, establish partnerships and be able to fully take advantage of the transformation that is ongoing. And in terms of preparing for future crises, what we see from the countries that have been more resilient throughout the crisis, there is a strong need to invest in enhancing the resilience of statistical and data systems. And we heard that from the keynote address, what some of the important areas are, such as strengthening the foundational data, making sure that our CV registration systems are well in place, at the same time embracing innovation and enabling countries to adopt some of those solutions that are readily available, but they're not necessarily there for them to, and they don't not necessarily have all the skills to utilize them fully. So I'll stop here. Apologies again for the PowerPoint not working perfectly, but I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you. Over to you, Grant.
Thanks very much, Francesca. I think that was a very clear presentation. And, you know, I think we really managed to take away the key messages that you mentioned there. Very much consistent with some of my opening remarks. I think it's great to get that sort of global view of how statistical offices are trying to meet that double burden, as you described it, and they slowly are organizing themselves to do that as this COVID pandemic continues, and some innovations are indeed improving. And so I think for the remainder of the panel, we're going to complement that sort of bird's eye view of what's happening through the survey taking that the World Bank and the UNSD is doing, with some specific descriptions of what's going on in the ground. And our second speaker we'll start with is Ms. Sandra Quijada, and she's the director of the National Institute of Statistics in Chile. And she's now going to provide her experiences and the experience of her offices through the pandemic. And it's through a recording. So we will play the recording now. So I will ask if the colleagues in the Secretariat can roll the film, as we used to say. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. For the National Statistics Institute of Chile, the opportunity to attend this meeting is of great relevance because it provides us with a space to exchange our experiences and strategies in confronting the health and economic crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. The first challenge we faced was maintaining operational continuity with our normal statistical production processes. The health crisis forced us to adjust fieldwork protocols by introducing measures for the protection and care of the staff and informants of our institution to minimize the risk of contagion. In the first phase of the pandemic, we had to suspend face-to-face data collection and rapidly transition to teleworking, while concentrating on telephone and web-based data collection for our main products. We have continued this mode of collection, limiting face-to-face collection to priority data that cannot be accessed remotely. Telephone interviews have been an important adaptation to our collection processes, especially for household surveys. Prior to the pandemic, however, this mode of collection was seldom used in our institution. Thus, we had to adapt our computer system and work procedures to ensure the continuity and publication of our main indicators. Because our economic surveys of enterprises are based on self-reporting through web forms with the assistance of analysts, this mode of collection has not been fundamentally altered. For this type of survey, the great challenge was communicating with companies that had suspended their activities or that had transitioned to teleworking. Both situations negatively affected their response levels. For price statistics, we have drastically reduced face-to-face collection, reserving this mode of collection for establishments whose prices cannot be collected by telephone or through the web. In contrast, price capture from websites, a method used before the pandemic, has significantly increased. In addition, the pandemic has led to an increase in our use of complementary data in administrative records. During the pandemic, one of the most important issues has been the timeliness of information. To maintain a statistical production under changing conditions with more limitations, we have taken certain measures, in addition to those already mentioned, to adapt our production to priority information needs. These additional measures are the following. Development of dissemination activities. We have had to focus communications of the impact of the pandemic on statistics. Increased provision of georeference data. In 2020, we launched a geostatistical data platform to identify active COVID-19 cases and to provide socio-demographic population data generated from census information and economic statistics. Changes in product planning and publication. We rescheduled the structural survey related to earnings and labor cost indices, the agriculture and forestry census, which was moved from 2020 to the current year, and the population and housing census, which was moved from 2022 to the following year. Suspension of operations. Because of the health measures and budget cuts, we had to suspend the National Time Use Survey. Despite this limitation, our institution has produced updated information regarding the impact of the pandemic on the country's socio-economic situation by incorporating thematic modules into the National Employment Survey and the earnings and labor cost indices. With the collaboration of the Ministry of Social Development and Family and the United Nations Development Programme, we have used our experience in telephone collection to develop 3 versions of a special household survey, the Social Survey on COVID-19, whose purpose is to assess the impact of the pandemic on the living conditions in our society. The various pandemic-related measures we have introduced are likely to permanently change our statistical production processes. We have always highly valued the technical support of international organizations, and we value this support even more so now under the changing circumstances of the pandemic. Together with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, we have led the Knowledge Transmission Network, which provides the region's statistical offices with the space to share experiences and practices of adaptation during the pandemic, thus strengthening our processes and helping us to improve as institutions. Finally, I would like to observe that throughout its history, Chile has been affected by geophysical, meteorological, climatic, and health events. The magnitude of some of them has been catastrophic, including the 2010 earthquake and the current COVID-19 pandemic, and they have had significant impacts on the population and economy. Our institution has therefore been interested in collaborating with the National Office of Emergency to create a register of disaster-related statistics that consist of the classification and codification of natural and anthropogenic events. With this register, we could organize and systematize these statistics using statistical language. And a theoretical foundation to produce a useful tools for recording these events and their impacts, which would be available to all organizations that gather this type of information. I would like to say thank you for your attention, and thanks for Statistics Korea and the United Nations Statistics Division for organizing this activity, which has provided us a valuable opportunity to reflect on the production of official statistics. Thank you very much.
I think we should all, at least in our minds, thank our colleagues in Chile for that terrific video that was made. It's pretty clear from that intervention that they've had to really sort of readapt a lot of what they were planning to do in order to focus a lot of their statistical products to the pandemic recently. I was interested in hearing about how they were moving much more quickly than it sounded like they were expecting to geo-reference data, because that was so critical for, I think, planning, and a greater focus on communication. And I think, if anything, really will resonate across the entire spectrum of dealing with the pandemic. It's probably more of an acute focus on communication, because there's such a risk of misinformation being circulated through a pandemic, and we have seen cases of that. And it's delightful to hear that they really valued the support of international organizations, and I think that calls into some question the nature in which how perhaps the community at large can help prepare for thinking about what the next crisis is, realizing it won't be like the last one. So I think those are some really important messages, and I thought that was a very compelling video. So thanks again. Our third speaker out of 4 is Ms. Nguyen Thai Huong, and she's the Director General of the General Statistics Office in Vietnam. And she's now going to provide a presentation on the experiences of her country in adjusting to these double burdens and dealing with the challenges presented by disasters. So please, over to you, Ms. Huong. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Nguyễn Thị Hương, Director General Statistics Office of Vietnam. My presentation includes 3 parts. Part 1, impact of disaster on statistic activities. Part 2, responses of the ZLOs. Part 3, recommendation of the ZLO to international organizations. Now, we start with part 1. Because of limited time, I will not present the impacts of disaster on support activities. We will go directly to item 2, impact of disaster on statistic activities. In 2020, the ZLO conducted 2 surveys to assess the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the enterprise, production, and business activities. At the same time, ZLO added questions related to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the labor and the employment and income to the monthly labor force survey. The ZLO statistic information collection in the EA has not met the requirements set forth in the statistic survey plan. Processing and aggregating the statistic information collected from survey also are not on schedule. The quality of collected information is disgraced. The examination, verification, and updating of information phase, more difficulty take more time. The coordination mechanism in providing disaster-related data is not timely and complete. The system of statistical indicator on disaster has not been developed. Analytical and forecasting methods have not met the requirements, except for reports and the yearbook. Some statistical publications are not public and scheduled. The forms of dissemination statistical information, such as express conferences, must be displayed. Now, we go to part 2, responses of the theaters. 1. Rules of the theaters. The theater always affirms its important role in providing impartial, accurate, complete, and timely statistical information, assessing impact of natural disaster and pandemic, surveying, studying and analyzing short-term and long-term effects of disasters. 2. Responses of the theater. The theater has applied a digital document management system and a specialized digital certificate application, developed a job management software system, offline and online meeting system, connecting the whole system from the country control to the district level. An operating ecosystem was built. The theater has promptly issued professional statistical guidance documents for all statistical surveys, provided in notifications on applying measures to collect statistical information in the EA during the implementation of social distancing. The theater has implemented the IT application in collection the server to perform remote statistical information processing and aggregation activities. For statistical analysis and forecasting activities, applying social economy activities, models to catastrophic shocks and epidemics, electing suitable methods, updating the quarterly economic growth scenario, and analyzing the resilience and elasticity of economy because of COVID-19 pandemic, organizing online training courses, receiving remote technical support from international organizations, strengthen channel for disseminating statistical information and diversifying forms of statistical information dissemination. Regarding the cooperation with ministries, line ministries, the theater has strengthened using the administrative databases, coordination, sharing, exchange, and statistical information collection through online mode. For international cooperation activities, the theater has complemented measures to adapt to new conditions, actively used IT. The theater has changed the form of the teaching and training from face-to-face to online, connecting 63 province statistical offices across the countries. The ZSO encouraged its civil servants and officials to work from home, support civil servants, and access data remotely while ensuring no security risk. The GSO builds a system of statistical indicators on disaster and set up geographic information system. Now we go to part 3, the last part. Recommendation of the ZSO to international organizations. The strategy of the ZSO in the current pandemic and disaster is as follows. The ZSO strategy orients to build a comprehensive, timely, and effective cooperation framework with ministries related to this field to collect, analyze, publish, disseminate information more comprehensively. The ZSO developed an assessment framework for information needs in general and information needs related to disaster risk, epidemic in particular, at the same time improves existing statistics, develop and expand many new statistics, upgrade the IT infrastructure in the field of the statistics to before serve the data use needs. The ZSO raises 4 proposals to the international organization as follows. The international organization should assist the national statistic offices in developing a framework, a concept, definition of the methods for calculating emerging indicators, methodology for measuring the impact of disaster, providing technical assistance of using appropriate analysis tools and models, improving their capacity to focus, analyze and assess the impact of disaster, applying geospatial data, research, apply and deploy big data and new data sources in the production of the statistical information, establishing a sustainable cooperation mechanism between countries, statistical experts, and international organizations, strengthen response capacity, and building early disaster warning system, emergency response capacity, as well as financial strategy for comprehensive disaster risk management. That's all. Thank you for your kind attention.
Oh, and thank you very much for that very clear presentation. It's much appreciated by the audience and I think the other panelists. And I think it's provided another really important sort of look into the experience of a national statistical office, you know, over the last 18 months or so, and the challenges that are coming up. And thanks for sharing your recommendations on how I think as a collective, as a community, this group can move ahead. And that may be something we can discuss a little bit amongst ourselves. And when we get into a little bit of time and discussion, are these models of sustainable cooperation between countries and international organizations. So I'm just putting that aside. I think if there's others in the audience that are interested in posing questions or wanting to drill down on some of the issues that are raising, I think you can put information into the chat box in the live stream session of the website, and perhaps within the chat box of this Zoom. I'm not sure about that, but I think there's a couple of mechanisms to pose some questions. So anyone out there who wants to probe these panelists, I would encourage you to do so. And so now we're going to move to our final panelist, and that is Ms. Carol Coy, who's the Director General of the Statistics Institute of Jamaica. And it's a nice complement to what we've heard from our earlier panelists. Jamaica, of course, is a small island state. It's in the Caribbean, and so faces different types of disaster challenges in relation to producing statistics. And now we're going to hear a little bit more from her. So over to you, Ms. Coy. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. I seem to be not able to share my screen. Okay. I just want to thank Statistics Korea and the UN Stats Division for inviting Jamaica to participate in this conference. Just looking at an introduction for those who do not know, Jamaica, we're in the Caribbean. We're in the Central Caribbean. Our closest neighbor is Cuba and Haiti. And we are a small island developing state, and we are susceptible to natural disasters, hurricanes. In the last 3 years, we have had some catastrophic hurricanes, tropical storms. We are also susceptible to earthquakes, volcanoes, not Jamaica, but some Caribbean countries such as St. Vincent would have had volcanic activity. And we're also characterized by underdeveloped national statistics system. Jamaica registered its first COVID case in March 2020. The measures implemented were, I think, similar across the world, where you had stay-at-home orders, travel restrictions on public gathering and entertainment events. The travel restrictions would have been particularly devastating for a country like Jamaica, where tourism is its largest foreign exchange earner and contributes significantly to the economy. What were some of the impacts on the Statistics Office on our daily operations? The operations are starting, as we are known. It was significantly reduced, but the office remained open, and that was in the early stages. We are now going through a third wave of COVID, and we are now having lockdowns where the office has been closed this week. So we are in the early stages, we didn't have lockdowns, but we now are having such events. So what happened to us is that we faced the dilemma of suspending surveys at a time when access to information was critical, because in the early stages, there was little known about the virus and we weren't sure of the impact. So we faced that dilemma, as I said. And so in April 2020, our quarterly labor force survey was canceled. We also canceled our 2020 annual survey of living conditions. And this one was a dilemma because this survey provides data on poverty. And so currently we have no idea as to the impact of COVID on poverty in 2020. Our monthly CPI was also affected by the closure of some businesses or difficulty accessing establishments. Another impact on the NSO was the reduction in budgetary support. Resources were transferred to COVID mitigation measures. Tax revenues, the government didn't really have a choice. Tax revenues declined significantly. And as I mentioned before, hotels and restaurants declined by 54% in 2020. And so the population and housing census was postponed. It should have started in April 2021. We have postponed it to April 2022. and we keep our fingers crossed that we can do it in April 2022. The census budget was slashed by about 90% in the last budget year. So what were some of the measures that we implemented? There was a work from home instituted among staff. This, however, it resulted in an increased expenditure on IT and communication infrastructure because we're a small country, so the IT infrastructure was not such that would have allowed work from home. So we had to expend quite a bit on this. You suffered from internet connection issues. That were some of the issues that you faced in working from home. We also had to develop systems to ensure that productivity was not negatively impacted, because we wouldn't have had such measures in place prior to COVID. We, however, since the early stages, we have had to adjust our operations to operate in what is now the new normal. So with the provisions of PPEs to our data collection staff. Our establishment surveys were not really impacted because it's a self-reporting survey. And so it is just to get in touch with the establishments to provide that information. What was the response of the statistics system in Jamaica to the new data needs? Given the rapidly evolving situation, there was a recognition from us that you needed urgent, timely information. This was critical. We recognize that the traditional approaches to data production and analysis would not be able to satisfy this need. All our data most of our data was face-to-face. And so we had this dilemma of how now do we collect data given the impact of COVID? And so we realized that we would have to change our approach to gathering of data. There were efforts to improve coordination, another major thing, of the research and production of data regarding the impact of COVID-19, given the need for timely information, because we recognized that it needed more than the NSO. It needed the whole national statistics system to work together to provide this information. In Jamaica, this coordination was operationalized through the creation of what we call a national research agenda for COVID-19. And this research agenda had a number of areas to it. There was clinical and laboratory, there was epidemiological surveillance, there was looking at the health systems, there was a socio-economic segment of it. Communication, we felt, was an important part of it, to communicate the information and how do you communicate it. And the issue of also the development of policy, because government would need to use this information to develop policies to deal with the results or the impact of COVID-19. Under the socio-economic research agenda, this was co-chaired by STATIN, the NSO, and Jamaica's Ministry of Health and Wellness. It included a wide cross-section of stakeholders across government, academia, and private sector. So we had maybe over 20 to 30 organizations. And the primary goal of this research agenda was to provide relevant and timely information for policy and decision-making during this time of crisis. Another objective of this research agenda was to improve coordination to optimize research efforts and outcomes in a whole of society response to producing data. One of the features I find of small developing countries like Jamaica is for the international development partners. They tend to come in and they go to specific agencies to develop surveys, and what you find is a duplication of effort. So you'll have different agencies or academia, and I presume because funding comes with this request, you'll find academia or even other government agencies really moving to get this. And so the thinking behind it was that if we had a coordination, then what you would have is a much more optimized and efficient way of collecting data for government. And so this research agenda looked at 3 areas. There was government and public-private partnerships, and here we would be looking at government response to COVID, hospitalization. Now we have included vaccines. How is vaccines moving data on that? Looking at the impact on the fiscal side of government, on the budget, on expenditures, and also looking at private sector expenditures on areas of COVID. Looking at society and household, here we're looking at the research at how has COVID impacted the society itself and on household. Here you're looking at poverty, and as I said, 2020, because we didn't do that survey in 2020, we wouldn't have impact of poverty. We are actually doing it for 2021, although it's a much smaller survey, given the realization we have to limit the contact between our interviewers and households. And these surveys are difficult to do using telephones. Also looking at education. One of the biggest impact we find in Jamaica on the COVID is the impact on education, because schools have closed. They're working remotely. And so we need to assess the impact on education, on children accessing it, because a significant number of Jamaican children have not been able to access online learning in the last year, either because there's no access to internet or access to devices. How has this impacted examinations? Looking at households, the impact on income. When we look at business, industry, and trade, that research would focus on the economy, on specific industries, on the labor market. And so what are some of the outcomes that we have had on this? And as I said, the engagement with critical stakeholders was very important, especially with the private sector, for us to have a coordinated look at the impact of COVID. Jamaica did its first national representative telephone survey during this period to capture data on knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions of the population. This survey, it was a difficult survey for us. It's the first we were ever using telephones. Most Jamaicans use mobile telephones, and it's what we call the prepaid. It's not a postpaid. So it's difficult to get at a representative sample unless we went to the mobile providers. And so we had to work closely with the with the mobile telephone providers to try and get a sample. We also in Jamaica got support from UNECLAC, because it's the first we were doing this, to provide technical assistance in doing such a survey. An important role also is the increased use of administrative data. Because we had this research agenda, we were able to get access to quite a wide variety of administrative data to provide information on what was happening. So we usually do, for example, an employment and earnings survey. We now have access to government administrative data on earnings, so we can provide that information on it. Because of this also, we have attached a number of modules of regular surveys to our regular labor force survey to look at the impact of, as I said, income. And we have come out with a number of indicators as how the COVID has impacted the labor market, significant reduction, especially in some industries, how it has impacted household income. We saw significant reduction in household income, especially those occupations that are at the lowest skill level. You'll see the impact on them. With regards to the coordination, I'm not sure how successful we have been with this, because I still think the international development partners, I don't know the thinking behind, but they seem to still go around this research agenda rather than working through. So I think that is an area that we might have to work on. So those are some of the how we reacted to the impact of COVID. Thanks.
Thanks, and thank you very much. Yeah, another very clear and well-articulated sort of recount of a small island and its dealings with trying to adjust its statistical projects and programs, and then dealing with kind of new modes of collaboration. Yeah, I was interested to hear about this national research agenda, and I think that sort of is one of the common themes that maybe I'll just ask our panelists. We don't have a lot of time, so I was trying to think of like maybe just 2 questions that I could get anybody who'd want to chip in on to do so. I think the first one is just on this sort of at the national level. There seems to be a lot of evidence that there's more collaboration across line ministries, research communities, academia than we've had in the past, I guess, to respond to the new types of demand. And maybe one idea that might be interesting to know is, you know, once we do get past the pandemic and things go back to whatever the future normal is going to look like, how will those relationships, obviously keeping those relationships thriving would be, I think, beneficial to the statistical community. But, you know, how do we kind of keep those going in absence of a crisis? So, you know, I think that there's always going to be policy challenges and new challenges. People tend to rally with a lot of energy at a crisis time, but when things start to settle back into the normality of things, you know, I think there may be a lost opportunity to try and sort of cultivate or nurture that kind of a collaborative agenda. And I think we heard that from Jamaica, we heard that from Chile, and then of course our colleague from Vietnam was talking about trying to build a comprehensive, timely, and effective cooperation framework. So that's, I think, one question that, I mean, if anyone wants to come in on. And then I think our colleague from Jamaica did a really nice job articulating perhaps some of the less than optimal behavior of the international community, not working through these new collaboratives that have been formed and perhaps using their own chains. So questions about how maybe the international community or even the broader statistical community, how does it sort of have to change? A lot of what has happened in the past is a lot of efforts to create common standards and then provide TA and that sort of thing to meet those standards. But are there some experiences either coming from the survey or from your own experiences that might think of we might want to, from an international standing, think of prioritizing where the effort goes next? Will the status quo be what is needed after we've worked through this pandemic? So in terms of, you know, the way a standard setting is a fairly lengthy process, but then we saw there was guidance issued quite quickly on things like mixed modes or new modes of survey taking. So I think there's this opportunity to reflect about some of those international processes to see if they could become more nimble and agile. So I'm not going to pick on anyone, but if someone can raise their hand or perhaps just jump in, if anybody would like to comment on this idea of sort of changes internationally to sort of provide more support, or how to sustain some of these cooperative mechanisms that have been, I think, very unique and innovative at the country level. Would anyone like to comment on either of those things?
Okay, Grant. Carol here.
Thanks.
From Jamaica. In the case of Jamaica, because we're in the middle of developing our national statistics system, I think this has been an opportunity to move that process forward. And I think we have seen the benefits of it. And so I think it's incumbent on the NSO to keep on driving this process. We think it gave us a good opportunity in Jamaica. And I think it's, as I said, it's incumbent on us to really move this process and do not let the process fall. In the case of Jamaica, the importance of it actually went to our cabinet, which is the highest political directorate. And so we got the buy-in from cabinet and the approval for it. So we hope that that will keep the process moving.
Great. No, that's good. I mean, it sounds like, I mean, the timing of your kind of agenda, and it was nice. Thanks for pointing out the fact that, you know, it might have revealed something to the staff and the working culture of the organization, that the value of this kind of broader agenda can bring to the statistical office. Francesca, I think I'll give you the last word because we're kind of running out of time in terms of any response, but drawing from what you know from the survey, do you see anything that could address these two questions? A slight tweaking of how perhaps international support needs to change in the future, or the idea of sort of gathering more information from country experiences on how these domestic collaborations have formed. Is there any reflections from your side?
Yes, thank you, Grant. I'm thinking that perhaps some of these collaborations and the transformation in the role of the NSO had already started with the SDGs, because many of the data requirements of the SDGs were such that the NSO had to sort of step out and work more collaboratively across, and also strengthen their role in terms of acting as coordinators, as brokers, etc. What I think the COVID-19 has done, the pandemic, as you said, created a sense of emergency. And so they went even further in embracing more innovation and sort of daring a little bit more, right? And establishing new partnerships and new collaborations across, outside also the government, with private sector, etc. So how do you build on that and make it sustainable and don't go back to business as usual once the pandemic is over? I think it's, as you said, it's also our responsibility as international community, and in general as the global statistical community. We've been slow as in providing, you know, the frameworks and the tools and the methods and the technical support when it comes to new areas of work. So perhaps it's our responsibility to be more agile. You know, we see that phone surveys work. We see that collaboration across the system works, and they can use alternative data sources when it's needed instead of waiting until we have the perfect framework in place. We have to strike a balance between ensuring the quality, but also being rapid, agile, and providing the support for countries to be able to use these tools now and continue to use them in making the new solutions part of the regular data production. And I think that is happening. As countries have moved so rapidly, and many of them have really used this as an opportunity, I think the international community and many of the partners have also moved a little bit faster and have been able to find that balance between ensuring quality, but also providing the necessary new tools and new support.
Great, thank you. That's a great insight. I think I'm going to start to wrap things up, unless anybody on the panel has anything more that they want to say. I mean, I do think that there's a couple of main takeaways I'd like to summarize. I think the first thing I would say is that, you know, obviously the last year and a half has probably been one of the most challenging for, I think, probably our planet, but also for statistical offices, and this double burden that I think Francesca articulated during her presentation of having disruptions in how they do things just at a time when the demand for what they do is at its perhaps 100-year peak. And you know, and even though that was probably a very difficult time to go through, I think it has revealed probably ways in which there's new forms in which the statistical offices can connect with others at the domestic level to demonstrate their prowess, their relevance, and to sort of gather more capacity through a broader network in order to create new products and services that are very relevant to their societies. And I think just finishing off with what Francesca said, I think there's been sort of encouraging movement amongst international communities to be a little bit more nimble and agile to provide support. But probably we need to think a little bit more as a community about how we can kind of nurture and foster both of those pieces of progress that we've had, both in terms of keeping these domestic new forms of collaboration active and having a more responsive global community to support those. So I think it's been a very interesting panel discussion. I think we've had a really, really great insight from our country representatives, the circumstances that they went through. So I want to thank them very much for the time and their efforts in putting together very clear presentations. I'd like to thank Francesca from USD for the overview. I think it was a really great overview and really set the stage nicely. And thanks to the folks who are, I guess, our colleagues at Statistics Korea who are carrying the can on putting this conference together. So thank you for the opportunity and for the support of making things work through this session. And with that, I will adjourn the session 1 whole minute early so you can relax before we get into the next session where I'm presenting something. So I better find that presentation in the next 30 seconds or I may be in the soup. So thanks everyone again for participating. It's been a great session and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me thank Mr. Cameron and the panelists for this great session. Carrying forward, I invite you to session 5, part A, titled Fostering the Transformation We Need to Respond to the New Challenges, New Data Solutions and Partnerships. If you registered at the conference and are joining us through a live streaming in our official conference website, you can choose either Korean or English channel using the live streaming menu options. Also, anyone joining us through our official conference website can participate in Q&A and discussion by leaving their questions and comments in the comments section located in the website under the live streaming tab. The website also provides detailed information of this conference, including its program, biography of speakers, and the presentation materials for downloading. With that, let me introduce the chair of this session. Ms. Jena Sloten, Senior Director of Policy at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, known as GPSDD, will be chairing this session. Ms. Sloten leads the GPSDD's work to translate norms into action for equitable, responsible, and sustained data use for development. She has over 12 years of experience in the UN working for policy-related issues, including the sustainable development and peace building, with a particular focus on the 2030 Agenda, development data, and the UN's peace building architecture. She has published several independent reports on peace building and fragile states and co-managed a research program on these topics at the International Peace Institute. Let me invite Ms. Sloten to take the stage for session 5, part A.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone, and thanks very much for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. As you heard, I'm from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and you're tuning in to session 5A, which is entitled Fostering the Transformation We Need to Respond to New Challenges, New Data Solutions and Partnerships. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. We'll introduce the panelists in just a moment, but a few context-setting remarks from me. I think especially for everyone who's been tuning into the conference since the beginning, recognizing that we find ourselves in an era of increasing overlapping crises. Of course, there's the pandemic, but we're seeing storms, fires, floods, and significant crises and disasters, which are posing a challenge for policymakers, for governments, for people everywhere. And the production of statistics and the use of data is no exception. The global pandemic, of course, has sort of accelerated the demand from policymakers, but also from ordinary people of more timely and granular data to really understand what's going on in real time and make decisions. And not just in terms of case rates and hospitalization, but in terms of the impacts of this pandemic and other crises. So we're looking at needs across the spectrum in a range of sectors in terms of food security, in terms of economic impact. And that's posing a lot of challenges. In the material for this conference, we saw some of the data that came out from a survey undertaken by the UN and the World Bank, highlighting that 62% of national statistical offices have engaged in new data collection efforts as a result of the pandemic. Also, that over 50% of national statistical offices have set up new platforms to serve public data needs. Those are incredibly high numbers, and that represents an incredible amount of innovation and transformation in the face of crisis. And what we want to examine today is we want to hear about those innovations. And all of our speakers today have experiences and examples to share about some of those transformations. The way in which perhaps existing data has been used in new ways, new data sources have been used. And all of this has necessitated new forms of partnership, working across sectors, working with stakeholders in the data ecosystem that statistical offices have perhaps not worked with before. And of course, this innovation was happening before, but what we've seen is that it's been accelerated, and we really want to examine those lessons from the innovation that comes out of crisis, and assess what have we learned that can be sustained, what have we learned in terms of those new innovations that we can replicate, but also what are the sort of secret ingredients or special ingredients to making these new forms of partnership happen. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn to our speakers and looking forward to their presentations. Of our 4 speakers, we have 3 who will be with us live today and 1 who will hear a pre-recorded message from. So we're going to start with Grant Cameron, the director of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network's Thematic Research Network on Data and Statistics. Over to you, Grant.
Thanks, Jenna. It's good to be here, and thanks everyone for participating tonight in this session. It's much appreciated, and I'd like to thank both the UNSD and perhaps even more importantly, our colleagues at Statistics Korea for hosting this international conference. I think it's an incredibly timely topic. It seems every time you turn on any kind of media channel, there's something related to a disaster, and I think this is, I think Jenna did a great job framing so much of what has gone on in terms of innovation. And I think what my presentation is going to do, and I'm going to share the screen here now, so just give me a second to do that. And I hope you can see it. So can you now see the presentation? Can somebody nod? Yes, I've got a thumbs up, so that's great. And this is really work that's really predated the pandemic. I mean, we did it through the pandemic, but some of what I'm going to be talking about today is work that's been a little bit longer in nature. And I think the nice thing about this work, I think it's nice, I hope you find it nice too, is that I think it might help us set up ways of thinking about how we prepare for whatever's next. You know, there's that old adage that generals are always preparing for the last war. So how do you sort of take the experiences that we've all captured and lived through in COVID in statistical production, dissemination, and connections with users, and how do we avail of new sources, and how do we think about how we can do that without necessarily knowing where the next pandemic or the next crisis is really going to drive the demand for statistics. So the title of this work is Leveraging Partnerships to Harness Big Data. And this piece of work was focused on national SDG monitoring, but I think it's very germane for this conference. And the main author of this work was Dr. Cameron Allen. He's a senior advisor at Trends and also a research fellow at Monash University in Australia. And myself and another one of my colleagues, Hayden Dam at Trends, made some contributions to this work. And it's really based on a thorough literature review of both the academic and the gray literature, as well as extensive interviews with some of you in the audience and many others who work in national statistical offices. So I'm just going to move to the outline of this survey of what I'm going to say. And, you know, I'm really going to talk about quickly in 2 seconds or less what the summary findings are of this. And then we'll get into the sort of the context, a little bit of where we stand in the use of big data for SDG monitoring right now. I'm going to describe a way in which partnerships should form as a function of this point in the journey that big data, that NSOs are on when using big data in their statistical processes. And then we'll finish with a few practical steps on how this can all be codified and where to begin. So if you're just tuning in and you just have to leave because wherever you are, it's the middle of the night, I think there's sort of, these are the 5 key messages, and I'll finish with these as well. Measuring progress on development, and again, we focused on SDG monitoring as a really big challenge. Obviously, the challenge is even more acute when we're dealing with disaster-related circumstances. I think in both of those cases, big data holds promise for monitoring on national progress and again for disaster response. But we're seeing, as Jenna mentioned, national statisticians really have to partner with a different number of external entities to really gain access to take advantage of big data sources. And you know, what we will sort of present is that partnerships work best when one can sort of determine the state of maturity a statistical office is, and then it's easier to align with the right kind of partnerships that work best for your state of maturity. And then I guess maybe one thing that is probably becoming abundantly clear, incorporating big data into statistical processes takes more than just technical know-how. Other forms of external advice and collaborators is going to be important. I will spend 4 seconds on this slide. I think in other circumstances I would develop more time, but in this community, we know that the SDGs are a big agenda. It's a global agenda. There's quite a bit of commitment to it. And we know that monitoring the SDGs are a really big challenge. So I will leave it at that because I'm sure the group is convinced of that circumstance. The second thing I wanted to just highlight very, very quickly is there's been an incredible amount of pressure on the statistical community to sort of avail of big data sources to improve their products and services, make them more timely, et cetera. And so I think we're all, as a community living under this pressure to how come, as we heard in last night's keynote speaks, that I can't get real-time information on health the way I can get real-time information on the weather. And I think we all sort of face that sort of pressure. And how do we sort of take that pressure and the promise of all that information and turn it into all that new data and turn it into something useful? So I'm now going to really spend probably a fairly big chunk of time on the next 3 slides. This one is sort of the summary of the findings that we had on how big data can support the SDGs. And the promise is really uneven across the spectrum of SDGs. So the way you want to read this particular graph, because it's a busy one, and it's is that you can see each column at the top has that sort of now familiar square of SDGs. So we've got the 16 SDGs along the top columns. And then we have a series of rectangles, green shaded rectangles under each of those SDG goals. And that represents sort of the promise and where we stand of the sources of big data that can help support the particular SDG indicators underlying each of those goals. And you'll see the key takeaway here is that you've got a massive unevenness across these. If we look at SDG 3 health, almost 75% of the health indicators that the IEG SDG community have identified can benefit from big data. But by contrast, SDG 9, innovation in physical infrastructure, only about 8% of the indicators are really availing or can avail of big data in its current circumstance. Another very busy slide, but one that you really only have to take one thing out. This sort of shows, and again, there's all of this information is on our website. I had a link on my very first slide. So if you just go bigdatasdgs.org, you'll be able to find all of this in much more detail. But Basically here you'll see the type of big data sources on the outer ring and how they support each of the SDGs. And the only thing you really want to take away from this slide at this stage is just the issue of basically satellite and Earth observation data is one of the really major components of big data that's really emerging as a critical source. And there's a great challenge in the statistical community of harnessing, as we know, global Earth observation information. It tends to be done by a series of different types of producers, and oftentimes the sort of the technology and the capacity for the statistical office to sort of trust things from those global sources is challenged. So there really is work to be done to sort of better tighten the development of statistics, and particularly for disaster response, and their connectivity with the Earth observation community. So that's, I think, a really big takeaway from this work. The third thing I really just want to highlight is this slide that is also action-packed with a lot of stuff. Hopefully it'll keep you alert. And there's sort of three chunks of this slide that I'm going to take you through. And this is really this partnership model that's based on the maturity status of statistical organization. And we've come up with this, as I said, through a number of interviews with many in the National Statistical Office community. And I think I'm just going to sort of break down this slide into sort of three big classes. So the first row at the top, which are those kind of multicolored sort of broad arrows or chevrons, represent how we categorize the maturity state of a particular statistical office or system. And I think the statistical community has seen the use of maturity models a lot in the last few years to develop strategies to incorporate new technologies. And our paper sort of has ideas on how one can use that for big data adaptation and adoption. And I think we base this partnership model on the next three sort of pinky long arrows that are underneath it in the same slide. And these are the three sort of major capacities or capabilities that a statistical office requires. One is obviously in regards to, again, taking up big data into production processes. One is sort of just the organizational awareness, literacy, the support, big data use cases. So that's kind of a organization and cultural kind of dimension. Then we also have a technical dimension. How capable are the staff on board, and how capable is the underlying technical infrastructure in order to manage the challenges of big data? And then finally, how is the governance arrangements, the legal and regulatory context for being able to manage this information in a way that is ethical, that preserves privacy, and is transparent on how it's going to be used. So one can sort of look across the spectrum and assess a statistical office across those three broad capability sets, and then sort of kind of categorize them in one of these six sort of maturity states, ranging from nascent on the far left to pre-adoption of big data to early implementation, the dreaded implementation chasm, and then proficient and mature. And then if you look at the bottom of the slide, there's really about, I think, 7 or so types of partners that are necessary to support big data incorporation into statistical office production. And that would include some that are fairly obvious, like data providers, analytic providers, who are people who probably have a little bit more perhaps data science knowledge than statistical offices might have at this stage, people providing technical support. And then we have more that are a little bit out of the domain of what people usually think about. Brokers and conveners, those are folks that can really help guide a statistical office in trying to decide where to begin or what makes sense in terms of the other types of partners to get on board, depending on where they are in their state of maturity. Donors obviously play a big role if it's a low capacity, low funded statistical office. Legal partnerships for the issues related to governance that I mentioned. And champions and sponsors, which is really, really critical. There's very few instances where big data has moved into maturity in any circumstance without a lot of commitment, often from the executive branch, maybe from the political sphere, and certainly from the senior management of the statistical office. And so what we do with the next few slides And I'll go through this quite quickly because almost this one summarizes it. You can see the dots associated with each of these types of providers is sort of the intensity of how important they are at each state of maturity. So if we look at the nascent side, you know, our findings are that brokers and conveners are the folks that you really, really want to get involved in the game early on. Nascent stage to us represents a pre-big data environment. Here, the NSO and the wider statistical system have low awareness of big data and the potential value for using it in official statistics. And so the key partnership here is with knowledge brokers and convening organization that can raise awareness of big data's potential and start to build trust inside the organization for these new approaches. If we go to sort of pre-adoption, the NSO is starting to explore big data analytics, and its mindset is around experimentation. So it's a new form, it's a new level of maturity, more sophisticated. However, broad-based support from leadership is still lacking. Partners to find financing for projects, including from international donors or government allocations, are important. And partners to advise legal frameworks are also critical. So you can see here that when we move from nascent to pre-adoption, a lot more different types of partners are required to sort of push the momentum of this. And then actually early implementation, which is the next slide, and where the little red rectangles are hopefully drawing your eye. In early implementation, it really is an all hands on board scenario. You really need to have a way to manage data providers, deal with the analytics, the technical partners, all the way and require the champions and sponsors. And this is because, you know, the statistical office at this stage of maturity is collecting big data from providers in different formats. They're beginning to make the investments in necessary infrastructure. And they're probably availing of a lot of external partners for technical and analytical expertise at this stage to complement their in-house capacity. So you can see at this stage, it's very, very intensive to have a array of partners on board. And I won't sort of go through in a lot of detail the remainder of the slide. The chasm, just in case, this is something that comes out of the organizational effectiveness literature. This is something where it's actually really hard. There is a kind of a glass ceiling between early adoption and more mature production stages that statistical offices need to overcome. Here you'll find pilot applications that have been deployed, but it's hard to have moved into sort of like the full range of capability governance and sustainable funding to really move this into the integrated production processes of the system. And then of course, once one passes past the chasm, some of these things like brokers and conveners, donors, and some of the other softer skills start to sort of soften as a requirement. So this is sort of the way we think that this type of framework might actually help statistical offices think through their challenges when not only reflecting about SDG monitoring, but of course preparing for whatever the next unanticipated disaster set of statistics are, where big data sources might need to be required. So knowing where you are on this scale and then having an understanding of what kind of partnerships would help you best to sort of navigate you through this journey, I think is something that it's important. The final slide I really have in terms of content is we do come up with 5 practical steps for trying to harness big data for monitoring. And you know, I would encourage you to go to our website again to read more about this. Getting big data partnerships off the ground is obviously going to be a critical practical step. Building the business case is going to be very important. Finding ways to navigate the governance and regulatory landscape is a critical point. Building the human and technical and capabilities and then sort of sustaining these big data partnerships. And I really want to emphasize this last thing on sustaining partnerships. I was just moderating the last session, and I think one of the things we talked about in that session was there were a whole bunch of new partnerships that sort of rushed together in order to address the challenges of COVID and the pandemic to build new products and services. How do we sort of sustain those in a more business as usual model? And so I think that's a big thing that I think the global statistical community really needs to reflect on is is taking the sort of the best strands and fragments of those partnerships and not letting them die off when things start to slowly return to normal. So just again, where I'm going to sort of start where I finished, or finished where I started, excuse me. You know, big takeaways are basically these sorts of things are a challenge. Big data holds a lot of promise, but it does require a fairly sophisticated awareness of where you are as a statistical office on this journey of incorporating big data. And it also requires a different mix of different types of external partners and collaborators that will work best with you once you've assessed your state of maturity. And again, just to reiterate, incorporating big data into these processes takes a lot more than just technical know-how. So thank you very much for your time tonight, and I will pass the baton and back to Jenna and stop sharing my screen. So thank you.
Thanks, Grant. That was a really, really interesting presentation. I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to hold until the end. I think you also created a nice entry point for Mark a little bit later in our panel on the geospatial information of the data source and satellite data Earth observation. But before we go on to Mark, we are going to hear from Rolando Ocampo, who's the director of the Statistics Division at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. I believe we have a pre-recorded presentation, is that right?
Good day to all of you, and thank you for the invitation for this International Conference of Official Statistics. My name is Rolando Ocampo. I'm the Statistics Director of ECLAC, and my presentation has to be with what we have done during the pandemic and what are the new challenges in this regard in terms of statistics information. If you allow me, I'm going to share my presentation. Okay, as I mentioned, so what I'm going to show you are the new data solutions and partnerships that we have done during the pandemic and what are our new challenges. First, let me begin with some actions that the National Statistical Offices have to make during the pandemic. And let me give you some examples. So for example, say they have to use alternative methods for the data collection of establishments. And so these new methods, with these new methods, they reach at least 50% of the information. So some offices and most of the offices have to go back to home and work and do telework. Some countries develop geoportals for visualization and monitoring the following of the COVID, the movements of the people during the pandemic. In addition, the countries have to change the way of obtaining information from the household surveys and use telephone surveys and we support them just to try and calibrate the models to ensure consistency and results. So, as you know, we have suspension of statistical operations in most of the cases, and some countries have to postpone their population census. In terms of in ECLAC, we try to support these activities since the beginning. So we have regional diagnosis. We launched 2 questionnaires, one in March at the beginning of the pandemic in last year, and the other one in May, and try to identify what were the problems that the statistical offices have, and try to support them in this regard. And with this diagnosis, we create 5 methodological documents with recommendations, and we have more than 16 meetings and virtual seminars through our knowledge transfer network of the Statistical Conference of the Americas. So we give some remote technical assistance with national institutions. And we have a special session in addition of the 19th Executive Committee of the Statistical Conference of the Americas, just focused on the COVID-19 pandemic and the adjustment that countries have made in this regard. In terms of modelation, so we have we create a model just to have projections of poverty and extreme poverty in 2020, and that information was used in the reports of COVID-19, special reports number 3 and 5 in the region, and the Social Panorama 2021. We create an additional geoportal, just and a specific web base in our ECLAC web base, just for the COVID-19, and we create a geoportal where we incorporate all the measures that countries have made during the pandemic in terms of movement across countries, economy, education, employment, gender, and social protection and health. And in this year, at the beginning of this year, we incorporate the vaccination that we obtained from other databases, global databases in this regard. We have a collaborative work in this with these measures with the civil society, in particular with CEPEI, just identify the relation of each of the measures that have through the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular with the 169 targets. We identify is the measure has a direct contribution and positive contribution, or if that has a hamper or negative contribution to the following of these targets. And in using this information, we decide to move to a new platform of our statistical databases in ECLAC called Cepalestat, and we define a new platform with open source, with more contents, with more functionalities, and all of this information in open data used to be downloaded for everybody in the region and in the world. We incorporate different platforms with different apps just to be updated, to update the information. But the most important thing is that we incorporate a geoportal in this regard to a geoportal that that can visualize all the statistical information that we have in the statistical database from geospatial side. For example, we create new dashboards, but you can identify and use the information from dashboard or Excel sheets or whatever, or visualization in the map in a geoportal, and to combine it and use this information. In addition, with this information, we began a project just to strengthen geospatial capabilities in the national statistical offices through these years, from this year to 2024. And our idea is to improve access to geostatistical data produced by the national statistical offices, to facilitate integration with other layers of geospatial information, and to support decision making for the construction of policies. What we want to do is create these geoportals, statistical geoportals in the statistical national offices, just to incorporate all this information for the construction of public policies and decision making. So what we are creating is a process to 3 years with a diagnosis, design of a statistical geoportal, the construction of the statistical geoportal within the countries. We decided to incorporate it with 7 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and with this, the construction, and then the application and implementation of the geoportal, and then the follow-up of the statistical geoportal through during the 3rd year, and then liberate all this information to be updated in the countries with the support from ECLAC in this regard. So what aspects should be kept in the future? Well, it is important for the statistical offices, the link with the geospatial information, just to be more active in this regard and to incorporate this information in more layers. And the collaboration with civil society, which is very important to introduce all this information that come from the stewardships, the big data, and all the administrative records and all those issues. The alternative methods of data collection, which is very important, and the use of administrative records to obtain information, which is a big issue to the process. And some others that can give you, can give us more information just to be used for the national statistical offices. This is what we are doing. This is what we are planning to support countries in our region in this regard. And with this, I close my participation, and I thank you for this opportunity to be with you, and thank you very much for this for this invitation. Thank you. Bye bye.
Well, we thank Mr. Ocampo for sharing his the experiences of the Latin American region with us. That was really interesting to hear, and some common themes already coming out around partnerships, but also around the use of geospatial information. And that is a perfect segue for us to hear from Mark Illiff from the UN Statistics Division. And he'll be focusing on geospatial information in disaster situations. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. I will assume that people can hear me with a nod. Good morning, good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Illiff, and I am with the UNGGIM Secretariat, which is the Secretariat for the United Nations Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management. It is effectively the sister institution which complements the Statistical Commission. We're also hosted primarily within the UN Statistics Division, so we're able to benefit from the close collaboration that enables. And really, I just wanted to start my presentation today with one of my favorite photos, which is the Earthrise, which was taken from Apollo 8 in December 1968, which is one of the first pictures we have of our planet. And really, it sort of shows us that we're on this this little rock in space together. And at the moment, potentially my children or their children will have someplace else to go. But right now we have one planet and we have one place to be. So when we're looking at how we transform our world, we know that we need data. We know that it needs to be high quality, accessible, timely, reliable, and disaggregated by income, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migration status, disability, and geographic location, and other contexts in the national context. But, you know, as a guiding principle for the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, this is the agenda that is trying to keep our planet on track. And unfortunately, even though we have these, you know, the SDGs, due to COVID-19, have really been knocked off track, which was sort of really highlighted within the Sustainable Development Goals report that just was released. And really, we have a real question in front of us. And it's, as the previous speakers have noticed, that there is a large role for geospatial information, for big data, and for all of those kinds of data that have a location component. You know, it's not just about data, it's not just about the technology, it's about bringing it all together. You know, we know that we have artificial intelligence, we have machine learning, we've got the Internet of Things, and we know that we've got the platforms to do it. And at some point, we will have statistics and geospatial information that we'll need to bring together and integrate to cross that digital divide that exists, a geospatial digital divide, for us to really attain the global frameworks that we have in front of us. Not just the SDGs, but it's also the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. We've got the Samoa Pathway, the Paris Agreement for climate change as well. But really, we're in a better situation than we've ever been. You know, as previously mentioned, that there is a nascent capability of countries using Earth observations, bringing in data from mobile phones, from citizens, but also integrating sort of the massive geospatial information that's already there to solve the problems that we have. So at the heart of this, it's integration. It's bringing it all together. So how can we do that? And how we do it, it's not just within the National Statistical Office. as Rolando mentioned, it's involving the different agencies and the different entities within the national ecosystem. It's the National Geospatial Information Agency, it's the National Disaster Agency, it's the National Land Registries, it's the private sector, it's the NGOs, it's civil society, bringing it together within national statistical offices. But also, previously within the SDGs, the National Statistical Office has been at the paramount of that. What role does the National Statistical Office have with respect to certain SDGs and certain indicators? For example, indicator 5.A.1, which is the proportion of total agriculture with ownership or secure rights over agricultural land disaggregated by sex, and B, the share of women amongst owners or rights bearers of agricultural land by type of tenure. The statistical agency obviously has a responsibility to be a custodian of that data, to be able to push that out, but it's going to involve many different components of the national ecosystem to collect that data. A national statistical office isn't going to become a national land registry overnight. So how can we build and strengthen those institutions within the national ecosystem to make sure that the National Statistical Office can do what it does best, which is reporting that data, which is pushing that data out, which is making sure it's in the hands of the decision and policymakers to make that evidence-based decision making. And by strengthening those agencies that feed into that ecosystem, we're able to strengthen decision making and policy making in their spheres of influence as well. So by creating a fertile environment for integration, it's not just going to be about statistics, it's going to be strengthening everything across our ecosystem. So what is the right data? What data do we have? And this is the point of the global fundamental geospatial data themes. Developed by the Committee of Experts, there are 14 themes that are considered fundamental for attaining the SDGs. So if you're wondering as a country, okay, what data do I need? This is a great place to start because you've got these different data sets and data themes from which you can create data sets that help you progress on your journey towards attaining the shared vision of the 2030 agenda. What are the frameworks that are out there? We have these global development frameworks, as we know, but we've also got global geospatial frameworks. And I'll talk a bit about those now. At the top of the list, we have the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework. Within disasters, we have the Strategic Framework on Geospatial Information and Services for Disasters. But also on the integration piece, we've got the Global Statistical Geospatial Framework, which really shows how to build the bridge between the statistical and the geospatial communities. And these are high-level frameworks. These are frameworks that can be used at a high level for you to identify the principles and practices that you need to develop at a national level. But also they can be used to advocate towards your national decision makers, your ministers, to actually turn around and say, right, this is a UN agreed framework. It's been developed by a broad consultative process. These are the directions that we need to go on. And these are the areas where we can strengthen. So on the IGIF, the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, it provides a basis and a guide for integrating, strengthening, and maximizing geospatial information management and the related resources in countries. It's meant to be, a very high-level policy framework for decision makers. How do you implement the IGIF? You do it through its 9 strategic pathways. They're a jigsaw puzzle. And the reason they're a jigsaw puzzle is because they're all interrelated. They're interrelated because you need to understand that these things are not meant to be built in silos. They're meant to be done through integration by bringing things together. So when you're actually bringing these pieces together and they're all joined, you're going to have a connected, integrated ecosystem nationally that's going to be much stronger than something that is a bit more disfranked, that is a bit more fragmented, that isn't able to be used in that way. And you'll note that they're guided by 3 principal areas of equal influence, whether it's governance, technology, and people. And this is the thing, in Grant's presentation, it was talking about big data and how big data comes through. And big data, as it was rightly put, is not just about the technology, it's also about the governance around big data. It's about the legislation. It's about accepting that we need to be using these technologies. It's about training people in the institutions to be able to use this data. And it's about having that technology available for you to achieve the benefits as outlined below. The GSGF, the Global Statistical Geospatial Framework, enables a range of data to be integrated. It really sets out for National Statistical Office that this is how I bring different data sets in from the geospatial community, ultimately ending up with harmonized and standardized geospatially enabled statistical data from which you can make informed decisions. Through the strategic framework on geospatial information and services for disasters, it's a guide for stakeholders to really gain access to geospatial information in the disaster context. You'll note that it's very similar to and mirrors the Sendai framework within its architecture. It emphasizes that the social, economic, and environmental risks and the impacts of disasters can be prevented or reduced through using geospatial information and its services. Now, ultimately, within this ecosystem, by starting to implement the strategic framework on geospatial information and services for disasters, not only are you going to strengthen your ability within disasters, but it will also start to raise other elements of your ecosystem too. So within this, there is a potential for information overload. So where do I start? And this is where the SDGs Geospatial Roadmap comes in. Our colleague, Kevin McCormack, in the session this afternoon or later this morning, if you're in the American time zone, will be providing a much more detailed discussion on this. But it's been developed by the IAG SDGs Working Group on Geospatial Information, the WGGI, with the vision to see geospatial and location-based information being recognized and accepted as official data for the SDGs, which includes key strategic messages and facts. And this is, a very key nuance within the language that we use when it comes to geospatial information. We've spoken about geospatial information as being adjunct to official statistics. It's as official and sometimes even more so than statistics. Geospatial information encompasses Earth observations. It encompasses automatic data collection. It encompasses all of these means which are not sort of formed through a statistical production process. They're formed through an algorithmic process, which can be authoritatively considered to an nth degree as being correct. So if we're assessing land cover or assessing the mountain green index or the water quality, these measures can be done through Earth observations in space. But yet there is still a barrier that we have to accepting these data, as official data for the SDGs and the global indicators. So the roadmap really sets out to build that bridge between those actors and demonstrate how, why, but also how countries are achieving it. Moreover, obviously there's more that we can talk through today, but also, I'd sort of like to highlight the future trends on geospatial information management, which is now in its 3rd edition, and the framework for effective land administration, as well as the standards guide. Now, ultimately, within all of these frameworks, it's about trust. It's about engendering that trust that we can have. So when the data comes to a National Statistical Office, irrespective of that national ecosystem, we can actually trust that the data we have can be used and then become official statistics. So really, to ask a question, how do we bridge the geospatial digital divide in our ever-changing world? And really the answer is we've got to do it together. We have frameworks, we have data, and we've met them with challenges. We're only going to get that together, especially if we're going to leave no one behind. But, through integration, breaking down those silos, we're going to be in a much better place than when we started in 2015 on our journey with sustainable development. And that situation is only going to get better. So even though the challenges in front of us may seem more immense and larger, especially recently with COVID-19, we do have a better ability to respond to those challenges. And that's the point. We can do it, but we have to do it together because we've only got one little rock in space. And as one of the residents of that rock, I intend to be living on it for as long as possible. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jenna.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Really interesting presentation. I hope to live on it with you. This has been a really nice sort of evolution across the presentations, because now we're going to hear from Anir Chowdhury, a policy advisor working in A2I Bangladesh, which is a unit within, I think, the President's office that's focused on innovation, and he'll tell us more about that. But I expect that Anir will share with us a number of really practical examples that are coming from sort of day-to-day work that perhaps exemplify some of what we've been hearing across the other presentations. So with that, over to you, Anir.
Thank you, Jenna. Can you hear me? Great, wonderful. So thank you for the invitation. So distinguished panelists and audience. From the first few presentations that I just heard, a lot of what you said, I'll talk about the examples. As Jenna pointed out, when we were hit by the pandemic about a year and a half ago, we didn't have a lot of official statistics to bank on to make real-time decisions. So we needed real-time data. And I'll talk about a few examples of how those things came about for responsive policymaking. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see this. Great. So all of you have talked about collaboration, so new types of partnerships that emerged during the pandemic in an unprecedented way. Some planned and some unplanned, but they were necessary. So the peacetime data collection and analysis for SDG reporting. So since 2017, we developed this tool called SDG Tracker. An SDG Tracker actually allowed us to get data from many different agencies of the government. About 80 different agencies pump in data into this one tool. But this was launched at the UN General Assembly by Honorable Prime Minister. And this has been a very effective tool for SDG reporting. We also have a tool for publishing data for open government data. So essentially about 50 different agencies are actually publishing data through the open government data portal. And recently we've also developed a version of the SDG tracker that's for parliamentarians. So the 300 or so parliamentarians in the country can track SDG progress and set targets for their yearly achievement, and then actually meet those targets or track progress against those targets. So this was the peacetime way of doing data collection across different agencies within the government, coordinated by our National Statistics Office, our Bureau of Statistics. But then enter a disaster scenario. So pandemic being the most prominent and the most influential one. We also have yearly disasters in terms of floods and cyclones, but I'll talk about them, but let me talk about the pandemic first. So during pandemic, what we saw was that we needed different types of dashboard, and I'll talk about the COVID dashboard that we developed since end of last year that really allows us to make quickly decisions now in terms of whether the disease is progressing and how we need to make health decisions. The problem with the dashboard was that most policymakers were not really familiar with dashboards because they sit as passengers in the car and the driver is somebody else. The drivers are the statisticians, and politicians and policymakers often don't understand data in the way they need to and don't understand real-time data. COVID changed all that, and policymakers started realizing that real-time data was really necessary. And surveys were not going to help in the way they worked before. So what happened was that we set up a cross-agency and public-private partnership data collection tools. I'll explain some of them. We leveraged big data to the extent that was possible in Bangladesh. And we developed a policy-focused analytics platform. So analytics platforms that actually spoke to the needs of the policymakers. And this allowed the policymakers to understand the near real-time massive data. So not only real-time, but basically sources that they had not considered before. It's paramount to do effective and integrated policymaking in times of disaster or crisis. So let's talk about health. We needed to track where the disease was progressing at a time when we had only one RT-PCR lab in the country of 165 million people. And this was the middle of last year. So May-June timeframe, April-May-June timeframe, when we did not have enough RT-PCR labs. So what we needed to do was to set up a syndromic surveillance platform where data was coming in from many different sources. So people were actually calling into this one call center, 333, and we had an IVR system and an artificial intelligence algorithm that would allow us to track a disease progression based on the calls originating from specific locations. And since we were using massive amounts of telco data for this, we actually knew where the calls were coming from, and we would know whether disease was progressing. Data was also coming in from hospitals, from the telehealth systems, from different private sector organizations. Slowly, we actually started expanding COVID-19 tests through rapid antigen and also with RT-PCR across the country. Frontline workers, they also started reporting data, and we also had community support teams providing data into the system. So what really happened was we had a massive data analytics platform that was a public-private partnership with the 4 telcos in the country, and we were able to create a risk matrix. And this data then allowed us to provide analytics for the medical professionals in the field and administrators with the cabinet division at the helm, and also a public portal called corona.gov.bd. That would be the central place for providing information to the public, tackling any kind of misinformation or disinformation. The COVID dashboard that emerged, that is now being looked at by a set of health professionals, public health experts, and they provide decisions and recommendations to the government based on data from many different sources, so telcos and many other sources that I talked about. So this has become the national dashboard for making COVID decisions in the country. And this is some of the most recent weeks that we have been going through. So as you will see, things are improving to some extent. So this is test positivity by district that we've been tracking. We also look at bed occupancy, and this has, again, data coming in from the hospitals. And this allows us to make real-time decisions about diverting patients to hospitals that have higher occupancy in the country. We also have started tracking mask wearing and mask distribution by different NGOs in the country. This also allows us to do public campaigns for social distancing and mask wearing based on where the behaviors are somewhat lacking. And as you will see that 10 highest and lowest districts based on mask usage and mask distribution are featured, and the district administrators and the health administrators in those districts make decisions based on data coming in from many different sources. So one thing to note here is that data into these systems come in from many different partners. So pandemic allowed us to form partnerships in an unprecedented way across different government agencies, beyond the NSOs, the private sector companies such as the telehealth and the telcos, many NGOs which are distributing masks, and also many different academic institutions which have actually allowed us to develop these algorithms in a matter of weeks and months. In a traditional way, if we had to go through procurement and bring in experts, it would have probably taken multiple years to develop many of these technologies. This is an example of the socioeconomic recovery tracker that we have built in partnership with UNICEF. And this allows us to look at the educational impact based on school closures across the entire country. But the telehealth, as I said, is a service provision across 25 plus different private sector organizations, also the government. And telehealth services with the COVID telehealth, then telehealth for pregnant women and lactating mothers. So these specific telehealth services are also giving us massive amounts of data in terms of comorbidity and diseases. This is a surveillance that we have done, which shows how the heart disease has been replaced by pneumonia as a leading cause of death in the last 1 year. So this is where the pandemic was the highest. That's when we saw pneumonia as the largest case of death. So essentially data coming in from many different sources, allowing us to make these decisions where previously we were not able to do this. This is the most recent innovation that we are trying out in the country, again from Togo, which proved that using data from the telcos, this was an algorithm developed by a professor in University of California at Berkeley. So data from the telcos analyzed through artificial intelligence, which used machine learning over a period of time, actually showed that inclusion error and exclusion error actually went down using this technique based compared to any traditional techniques. So this was done with a sample size of 10,000. In Bangladesh, we're just starting this work, and we've set up the partnership with telcos, the telco regulator, and the government agencies which would actually provide the social safety nets, and also UNDP. So it's a multi-party partnership that would allow us to do responsive social safety nets. We faced a problem last year when the Honorable Prime Minister announced a new form of social safety net, the pandemic social safety net, but we were not able to identify the deserving candidates because the new poor were actually scattered across the country. They did not exist in existing social safety net databases. So we had to do traditional surveys. The NSO was not able to conduct these surveys. So we actually had to resort to district and the sub-district administrators to do targeting and listing of the deserving candidates. About 5 million households were listed. But with this new AI-driven poverty ranking, we would be able to identify when people's poverty status actually changes. So this would give us a huge advantage in traditional methods. We have started partnering with Google. So Google flood forecasting system combined with the hydrologic model and hydraulic model that we had in the country before is actually allowing better flood warning. We have tried this for regular floods. This does not work with flash floods yet, but this has allowed us shortening of lead time from 5 days to 3 days. And hopefully, as the algorithm matures over time, we are expecting even shorter durations. So we can actually make much earlier prediction. This is a longer term problem that we're seeing. And this is not a disaster per se, but this is how the skills demand in the market is changing rapidly because of fourth industrial revolution and also because of shifts like the pandemic. So we're looking at data from about 20 different ministries and 40 different industry associations coming in together to predict how the market is actually changing in terms of skills demand. So I just wanted to bring this up, not as a disaster scenario, but also as a scenario where partnerships across different public agencies and private sector agencies are actually giving us a look into the future and allowing us to do better policy making. South-South cooperation is something I want to just point out, is that this has really been helpful. We developed a network called South-South Network for Public Service Innovation about 3 years ago. It now has about 42 different countries from different parts of the world. And these countries have worked together to not only share innovations, but also different stories of experimentation, some of which have failed, but the stories of experimentation has really been helpful in learning from each other. So I want to end with this 7-pronged approach that has really helped us. We call it the collective intelligence for improved policymaking. And I've talked about some of them already. The first one is breaking traditional data silos, very important. The pandemic has really allowed us to break traditional silos in a way that was not possible before, because everybody came forward in different parts of the government, and they were not holding on to their traditional control of data. And, so the turf control actually faded away to some extent. Whether this is sustainable or not, we still have to see. A lot of you have talked about, especially the previous speaker, talked about the geospatial capacity. So this is something we want to develop more and more. Our NSO is not fully capable of doing it right now. We actually have used other agencies within the government for this, but we would hope to develop the geospatial capacity of our NSO. Big data is not fully understood by our NSO, but as I explained, there have been several examples of how big data has been leveraged for responsive policymaking, and this will continue to be so. And we are doing a project right now with our NSO to develop a better understanding of big data within the higher echelons of the NSO. The fourth one is very important. Collection is only as useful as the presentation of the data in a way that they speak to the policymakers' needs at the right time. So developing intelligent analytics and visualization for policymakers is important, and that's a capacity that we're trying to build right now. The fifth one is building public, private, and academic partnerships, and we're calling them data collectives. So we've started an initiative around our NSO to develop these collectives so that different partners can come together, share data in a secure way, and they can contribute and build together and benefit together. Protection of privacy information has been a very important aspect of what we have done. To be very frank, during the pandemic, I don't think we have done enough protection of privacy. So when we look back, we're now developing a law that would allow us to do data protection and do privacy protection. And the last one, but not least, is promotion of South-South cooperation. So what we have seen is that an experimentation mindset is very important. Developing the HR capacity of NSO from a technocratic standpoint is important. Developing the right policy frameworks is essential. And funding that would allow us to do piloting, experimentation, but also when there is a success in terms of partnership and developing approaches and models that need to be scaled up. So funding is necessary for that as well. So that's the 7-pronged approach that we have developed over the last year and a half. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Jenna, back to you.
Thank you so much, Anira. It's just fascinating and incredible to see this sort of multifaceted partnerships and diverse stakeholders coming together in many of the examples that you shared. So by my clock, we have 15 more minutes in our, or pardon me, 10 more minutes in our session. And I'm going to pose a few questions to our panelists. Of course, Mr. Ocampo is not with us, so the 3 other panelists. And I'm going to pose sort of one question on a theme where I have some specifics for each of you. And the theme I'd like for each of us to focus on is the question of partnerships and how to get different stakeholders to work together in a sustained way. So for Grant, I noticed, of course, you highlighted that the number of stakeholders or partners that need to be involved is highest in that pre-adoption and early implementation phase of your maturity model. And I wondered if you had any insights as to the coordination capacity that is required to manage that phase, right? Because it's early in maturity and using big data, but I imagine also in partnership management, and yet it has high demands from the perspective of coordination. So I wanted to get your views on that. For Mark, your question is going to be around what you see as the barriers to collaboration across institutions coming from your perspective in the geospatial information community. And for Anir, in a very practical sense, you gave us so many great examples of partners from private sector, from civil society, bringing different data sources to bear, and across government. I mean, challenges, typical challenges outside of a pandemic, you would see massive barriers to getting that information from the health centers or from, you know, the employment centers. Like typically that kind of data sharing across government is not straightforward and easy. So what made it work, and how are you going to be able to sustain that level of collaboration? So that's my question for you. So we'll go to Grant first. Please, I'll give you about 2 minutes each, and maybe 3 if you're lucky. Go ahead, Grant.
Good. Well, no, and thanks for the question. And yeah, I enjoyed the other presenters as well in their presentations. I thought they were really helpful. I think in regards to this notion of the, I guess, the coordination burden, I think the study that we did found that in many cases you are building off a kind of something that isn't quite at early implementation, but there has been collaborations established. So it is sort of just starting to sort of continue to build the building blocks on what is there. So if you do have circumstances where you have been collaborating with a geospatial entity or with a telco, that gives you sort of the foundation to sort of plan a little bit more carefully to go from what the sort of that pilot phase is into the early implementation phase with a partner that you've already been working with. So yeah, I think it's critical to know that you want to sort of sustain sort of the partners you've had and build from that as you move ahead. It isn't a question with every phase you sort of start again with another round of things. It's a little bit more integrating new schemes, but I think you do have to recognize that as you are sort of expanding into a relationship with a telco company, that does then sort of enter into the challenges of data sharing agreements that involve a more sustainable relationship. So there isn't inevitably more facets to the work, but it's certainly building on what the earlier stage has done. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. And, really just to echo what Grant said about the other presentations, there's been a beautiful progression here today. And it's almost as if we'd conspired beforehand. And the fact that we haven't, I think, is sort of indicative we're in the right ballpark. So thanks to all the other presenters. When it comes to the barriers that we have to sort of crossing the geospatial digital divide, but also sort of barriers to partnerships, fundamentally it's the same problems that we have. It's trust and integrity, and it's about being honest with ourselves and our own capacities, and then working out, where do we draw the line? Where does the line of the National Statistical Office stop? Where does the National Geospatial Information Agency come in? And as Anir sort of really pointed out, that through the pandemic they were able to bring everyone together to actually help and solve a problem. And we've got some pretty big challenges in front of us that are coming up, and I really hope that we can really sort of trust ourselves and trust the national ecosystem, and actually be honest with our capacity, with our with the capacity of the institutions that are existing, to turn around and say, okay, maybe this isn't my strength. I need to reach out and I need to build those partnerships. And the sooner we do that, and if we're not doing it when a disaster happens, we can make sure that we're in a stable environment to move forward. And that's going to be underpinned by these frameworks. It's going to be underpinned by everybody understanding their role in how they're achieving a bigger whole, a bigger part. And, one of the things that I've observed as a geographer in a statistics division is that there is a primacy of statistics, that statistics is the end goal. And to a national statistician or a national statistical office, yes, that is the end goal. But how you get there is going to incorporate all those different perspectives, which those knowledge centers may not be in the National Statistical Office. And unfortunately, the fourth industrial revolution, technological transformation, is only going to make that more complex for those sort of traditional areas. And it's going to be outside those traditional areas where we need to actually integrate and bring those expertise and those areas of expertise into it. And I think that a good place for us to start is to actually recognize where we are, where we want to be, and go, okay, maybe this isn't our preserve. Maybe we need to bring those in. And instead of waiting for a disaster for it to happen, we do it now. So when the disaster happens, it's like, okay, we know what we're doing. You've got your role, I've got my role. We know what the decision maker needs. We just bring it through.
Great, thanks. Over to you, Anir.
Thanks, Jenna. The pandemic was, of course, an opportunity for collaboration. I mean, as any crisis brings people together, the pandemic has done that. I remember the first couple of weeks when we were faced with the pandemic, we didn't know how to track the disease, which we only had as I mentioned, one PCR lab in a country as large as Bangladesh, 165 million people. So we repurposed our 333, which is a national helpline for getting government information and services, as the number, which was already popular, so that people would call in. And we had to get the telcos on board to share that data with the government, which technically speaking, they were not really allowed to. So we had a group in WhatsApp. I call it the WhatsApp bureaucracy. So the 4 telco CEOs, the telecom minister, the chairman of the regulator, and myself. So we would discuss, and magical decisions, huge policy decisions would come out through WhatsApp discussions. That would have taken typically long meetings, legal reviews by the telcos and the government, would have taken months typically. And I wouldn't even be sure whether they would have happened. So this WhatsApp bureaucracy allowed us to make decisions within days and bring people together. Whether this will sustain or not, Jenna, is something that remains to be seen. I hope that it would, not probably to the same level of spontaneity and speed that we saw during the pandemic, but I think we have learned some valuable lessons. And one valuable lesson is that the horizon of possibility is actually very large. What we thought was not possible can actually be quite possible if we just put our minds to it. And as I said, we may have broken some privacy laws. We don't have a privacy law right now, but we may have some broken some international standards. But those are things we have to fix. But that experimentation mindset towards a single goal to benefit and make policy decisions in a real-time fashion with the time of crisis is something that we all understand, and we also understand that it is possible to do so. So that possibility, that understanding of possibility, I think, will sustain some of the gains that we have seen during the pandemic, gains of partnership. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anir. I think that saying that necessity is the mother of invention, right? So that's a really great note to end on, with that widening, and it's sort of a silver lining, right, of any crisis, and of this pandemic crisis, is seeing the transformation that's come and the innovation that's come out of it, and the learning, which I think we've seen on this panel in spades, and I think across the conference. So a big thank you to all the panelists, and whatever time zone you're in, for joining us, and to our audience for tuning in tonight. Thank you to Statistics Korea for organizing, and the UN Statistics Division. And that ends session 5A. Thank you, everyone.
Very much.
This
Have a good day and good evening.
Thank you.
This concludes session 5, part A. Let me thank Ms. Slotin and the panelists for this great session, and special thanks for being very punctual. This brings us to the end of part A on day 2 of the International Conference on Official Statistics. We will adjourn the conference and resume it in 4 hours. That is 3:30 p.m. in Seoul, 8:30 a.m. in Geneva, and 2:30 a.m. in New York. We highly appreciate your attention at this conference despite challenging schedules, and hope to see many of you in the next session. Thank you.